Okay, thank you all for joining us. This is Yoon Kim from 427. I am the Director of Advisory Services here, and I'm very much looking forward to hosting this webinar. I think many of you are already familiar with 427, but for those of you who aren't, we are a market intelligence company focused on bringing climate data to inform better and more climate resilient economic and financial decision making. And the topic of today's webinar is building city-level climate resilience. And so recent events like Harvey and the California wildfires have really underscored the need for cities to assess proactively physical climate risks and also to identify financing to support prevention and recovery. And so I'm excited to host today's panel where we'll be looking at an approach for assessing physical climate risks at the city level, as well as looking at how ratings agencies, S&P specifically, is incorporating physical climate risks into city and county credit risk. And then also what types of considerations investors look at when they're making city-level climate resilience investments. And so our first panelist today is Nick Steinberg, and he is 427's Director of Analytics, and he will be speaking about an approach for assessing city-level physical climate risk.
Great, thank you, Yoon. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Steinberg, as you mentioned, and I've been working at 427 to assess the attributable impacts of climate change on a number of systems, including cities and then larger municipalities. So I'm going to provide some introductory remarks on what climate risk is, how we measure climate risk exposure, and that's going to set up the conversation. So leave thanks to Sonia. So first, just some conceptual definitions to get us started. Let's first define what climate risk exposure is. And I do want to make clear what we're looking at when we discuss climate risk is the effects and hazards that may become worse in terms of its severity or frequency or duration as a result of climate change and its influences. So there have been a number of definitions to describe what exposure exactly is. In its simplest terms, it's the intersection of something we care about and a hazard. So you can see there that there are a number of things considered assets or items that are exposed to generally risk, but also to climate change impact specifically. Everything from people and property to economic livelihoods, ecosystems, broader infrastructure, and city systems. Now, my preferred definition is the last one there, definition number 3. Exposure is more than just the intersection of things we care about and hazards. It's actually a measure of how climate variability is changing, either in terms of its magnitude or its frequency or its duration or its timing. So I'm going to go through each of those characteristics of climate exposure in a little more detail, and then we'll look at some examples. So very quickly, there are a few things that we look at 427 when we talk about climate risk, largely because there is a climate change fingerprint, meaning there's an attributable influence as a result of a warming atmosphere. And those range from heat stress to water stress to rainfall and river-based flooding, all the way to coastal storms, so things like cyclones, all augmented, of course, by sea level rise, which we'll get into in a little bit later. Now, what is exposed and generally what's important to measure when we're looking at climate risk? At the city level, you hear a lot about people and property. Obviously, it's not only important for public health and livelihood, but also it's a very important tax base for cities. So depending on what a city is measuring in terms of its overall value, it's going to look at everything from its own critical systems, so things that allow it to operate, all the way to the residential areas that might be affected by particular hazards. Now, when we look at climate risk exposure, we're also looking at the spatial extent. So what parts of the city might be affected by a particular hazard, to what degree, and then also looking at how it's changing over time. So as climate change has a broadening impact, do we see that affect spatially? Is it affecting a larger amount of the city? Is it becoming more severe? Are inundation levels from floods becoming worse. And then, of course, city has to determine the importance of each of these assets that are to be exposed from climate change. So the relationship between credit rating downgrades and physical risk is nothing new. There are examples from Port Arthur, Texas, following Harvey, as well as recent hurricanes over Puerto Rico. Now, you'll notice, though, that these events are becoming significantly worse over time. We have good evidence that the intensity of rainfall and the energy that's charging a lot of these storms is worsening due to some climate influence. So the relationship here, we expect to obviously become more and more important as credit rating agencies look at the financial stability of cities and their ability to either finance resilience efforts or their ability to cope with some of these worsening impacts. Now, just an example here, if you want to dig in a little more of our approach and our methodology to assessing climate risk exposure, we just came out with a report yesterday that you can find online, or you can go to our website to read the full details. Now, I want to pick up an example for sea level rise in its connection to climate risk exposure because it's such a good example. There are a number of assets, including people and infrastructure and value along the U.S. coastline, and people are very familiar with the expected impacts from sea level rise on our cities. So we conducted a small study here in the Bay Area, the city of Alameda, which is just hanging off the east bay of San Francisco inlet. And they were concerned about their exposure to sea level rise and what it would mean for their local infrastructure as well as property. So one thing important to note when we're doing a climate risk exposure assessment, we want to look at future conditions and the potential impacts over an area. And so one great quote from the study here says, "Today's flood is tomorrow's high tide." So some of the normal conditions that we might experience in the future are very much extreme conditions today. So on the left there, you're looking at a 1 in 50-year event in 2030, and on the right, a 1 in 100-year event by mid-century. So you can see the change over time, and you can see that there's some very important infrastructure exposed to inundation. And this is the result of storm surge, but this is augmented, of course, by sea level rise estimates. So we're incorporating the effect of climate change and its influence on average sea level rise, and then in terms of timing, what that might mean when it coincides with a high tide or a particular storm. Now, when you look at different areas of the city, you can also identify very important features such as transportation. There in the upper left of the visual, if anyone's familiar with the Alameda and the East Bay, there are 2 ways to get on and off of the island. So this here is showing an inundation of the Posey Tube Tunnel, which would essentially cut off transportation coming into the city. So in terms of a disaster, this would be a very serious situation. And in terms of what the city would have to do to either abate these types of risks or recover, could be a very, very expensive endeavor. Now, typically cities will address climate risk from a disaster approach. So there are some prioritization methods that will be used. They'll typically look at the combination of probability, so how likely it is the impact will actually occur within a given time frame, and then what's the overall impact, which is very much a judgment call. So what is the impact to people, to property, to assets, and a lot of that depends on at what level they're valuing that particular item. And then, of course, the spatial extent. So what's the amount of area or systems that might be affected by this? And through this sort of heuristic weighting scheme, cities go through this process to identify what investment is most needed and what infrastructure should be prioritized. And it's not a always scientifically or quantitatively driven approach. There is a lot of influence and interest and priorities being put into this sort of decision. But this is generally an existing framework that is used. And when we talk about climate risk, much like disaster risk, we have to use some of the existing frameworks to make these decisions. There are, of course, limitations to understanding the extent of climate risk and its overall exposure within a city. Timing and precision are very much do not go together in the climate community because the timing of these events are very imprecise. We have windows of certainty, and then we have large ranges, of course, of potential impacts. So we have to consider, to some extent, there's a precautionary principle that's needed. We understand that the level of impact might be worse in 10 to 20 years, but we don't know precisely when these impacts may occur. There's, of course, a lot of uncertainty, too, about the population dynamics, migration patterns in a local area, and just the overall changes in land use over a city that may affect overall impacts. So I'm running out of time here, and I'm going to pass it back to Yoon and Lisa to get into the heart of the conversation.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, so thank you for providing that overview on our approach to assessing physical climate risks at the city level. And just a reminder to participants that you are welcome to use the Q&A function in Zoom so that if you do have questions, we can keep track of them and just make sure to answer them at the end. And so our next panelist is Lisa Schroer, who is a Senior Director and Sector Leader at S&P Global. And she'll be speaking about how the ratings agency is incorporating physical climate risks into its view of city and county credit risk. So with that, I will hand it over to Lisa.
Great. Thank you. So good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone. I think having multiple time zones speaks volumes to the level of interest we have on this topic. So thank you very much for having me on today. As noted, I am Lisa Schroer, and I'm a sector leader for local governments at S&P Global Ratings. And I'm really glad to have the opportunity today to discuss how S&P Global Ratings is factoring in climate and weather issues into our local government ratings. So I want to spend some time up front just giving a bigger picture of, setting the stage for what we do in our ratings universe, and then highlighting, of course, why weather and climate issues are on our radar, which I won't spend too much time on for this crowd, and then the deeper dive into how we incorporate these issues into our local government ratings in particular. So to start, you can see how many issue ratings we have, and if you look at that unfortunately light box, government securities ratings, it is an incredibly large number. Now, not all of those are US based, but I think what that does is really highlight the importance and focus of government and our ratings from our perspective. On the next slide, we're looking at US public finance in particular. I am mostly focused on this blue box, the blue portion of the circle, which is tax-backed, general obligation, and other types of taxes and appropriation bonds. So that is what we'll be spending most of our time talking about today. And I also wanted to take a moment to sort of level set as to what is a credit rating and what it is not. And so credit ratings are really opinions about relative credit risk. And credit risk, in our view, is the ability and willingness of an issuer to meet financial obligations in full and on time. They are intended to be forward-looking, and they do continually evolve, and they are intended to be comparable across different sectors and regions. But I want to make clear that we do not give investment advice. We don't give advice on how to structure your debt or anything like that. We really are taking this opportunity to explain our analytics and how we incorporate these risks in our views. So that is a credit rating. And then one other piece, which I think was sort of alluded to by Nick, is time horizon. The uncertainty of what we're looking at and what that means in terms of our credit ratings. For scientists, I think our horizon is much shorter than a scientist's would be. We are forward looking, but for an investment grade rating, we're really thinking about sort of a less than 5-year time horizon. Non-investment grade would be less than 2-year time horizon. So a lot of climate related risks may be further out beyond our credit rating or outlooks. Now that being said, we are not, unaware of longer term issues. And we recognize that we can look at these longer term issues, that a lot can happen with management and other actions that can change those long-term trajectories. And this is a balance that we've had to do as well with other types of long-term liabilities like pensions. So we are aware of long-term and we are able to factor them in, but there is a difference between the science and our rating horizon. So with that, take a bigger picture, why we care. And I think we all know that the growing cost of extreme weather events is a concern for municipalities. And then there's also gradual changes. You're seeing municipalities think about where they should be developing for land use. You're thinking about what types of jobs should come to the area and factories where they can handle the weather. And so there's likely to be a longer term impact on economic activity and economies. Again, here, nothing new to you all, but according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 2017 marked the worst year on record for damage caused by natural disasters since 1980, which was the first year on record. And so this is what, as a rating agency, we obviously have been looking bigger picture, but these numbers are getting larger and larger and the frequency is getting more prevalent. So big picture in USPF, across the board, we are looking at management's effectiveness and planning. Each sector has unique environmental and climate risks, and so we look at each sector's unique risks. In water sewer, there's clearly drought planning. Electric utilities, there's carbon fuel concentration. All sectors are really dealing with long-term financial and capital planning. And so we have the opportunity to really think about big picture, what are these issues that they're facing and what are the sector-specific issues that they're facing. So with that, I will go into our deeper dive on local government ratings. And so for those of you that have been a part of other presentations by this rating agency, S&P Global, you may have seen this diagram before. And this is a diagram of our criteria. And for those of you less familiar with rating land lingo, what criteria is, it's really our framework from which we analyze an obligor's willingness and ability to pay. We believe that our criteria is well positioned through several rating factors, including, but not limited to management, to incorporate weather-related risks. And we also believe that there's flexibility in our approach to adjust to information and events as they occur and as more information becomes available. And so what I'll do now is go through this framework and show you where we can really handle different aspects of climate and weather. So if I can get this slide, there we go, great. So economy, as you can see, is 30% of our underlying rating, and it really assesses income levels, tax value, broad regional economy, unemployment rates, and population growth. So from our view, the economy would be impacted by climate and weather through declines in the tax base, through changes in employment and income. Population migration is another way to factor these into our ratings. And so if a population is displaced and unlikely to return, we can factor that into our assessment of the economy. If property tax base is vulnerable to decline, we saw that happen with Rockport, Texas. We can factor that in as well. Management, in my opinion, is one of our strongest tools for evaluating the potential for impact and preparedness to these risks through obviously capital planning and long-term financial planning for risks that are maybe a little bit further out. Additionally, financial policies that protect against financial surprises or the need for liquidity when recovering from an acute event. Bigger picture within our criteria, we use financial management as an opportunity to understand what policies and practices a government has that supports its operations and stability. And so what this slide really highlights here are the policies and practices that we think are most relevant to assessing climate and weather risk. So the first one is long-term capital planning, and we can assess what types of capital plans they're doing, but it's also really our first touch point to see what the awareness of some of the climate or weather issues they as a specific municipality may be facing. And so this is where we're going to talk about what are the capital plans that you think you need to be doing in order to address sea level rise, or how are you addressing your flood zones, which I think we're seeing in the news is popping up with some additional bond requests. Reserves and liquidity, how much cash do you think you need to have on hand in order to allow your municipality to keep functioning if there is an acute weather event. And these two policies can really help us to understand whether or not a municipality is thinking holistically about the risks that face this municipality. Revenues and expenditures and budget and updates are more about how quickly can you react when you have had an event. So for example, if you have an event and you need to expend a lot more than you thought you had to, how quickly can you go back to the budget drawing board and figure out what other cuts you need to make? How is that process set up, and have you done it before? Does it function? For revenues and expenditures, what we're looking at is for some places after their weather event occurred, they had a large increase in sales taxes, they had some increases in development. Now, are you factoring in the fact that this could be a one-time event and therefore you should lower your revenue forecast going forward? How are you thinking about these events and how are they playing out in your fiscal planning? So this is where I think we have a lot of conversation and get to understand what municipalities are thinking. And then financial measures, and I've clumped these together. They are, each different risks, but there's the acute risk and then there's the longer term risk. And so for the acute risk, we're looking at, in the next year or two, from liquidity, operations, and budgetary flexibility, which we view as reserves. Do we think that they're going to be impacted in the next year or so by this acute weather risk, by this acute weather event? So for example, if you had a hurricane, let's say, and you use your reserves, will they be replenished? And will they remain strong? What is our view of your finances in the next year or so? But that's based on after an acute event. This isn't just that. We can also incorporate our view of longer term risks, and we can incorporate them through our budgetary performance, which is really our view of the longer term operations, the current operations, and then longer term. So if there is we can weaken our view of operations if we feel that certain important capital projects are being deferred, and that is really inflating operational results. So for example, if there are key risk mitigation capital projects that are not being completed over time, that means you're not spending money, so your operations look high, but in our view, you're deferring capital that is putting you at risk. We can also incorporate event risk, and this is a separate way of looking at operations. If you're an area that is exposed to ongoing risks and it has not been mitigated, we can incorporate that into our view of your operations as well. Now, debt is, I think some feel, a bit of a double-edged sword, and I'm going to explain why I say that. I think people feel, and I have heard this, I'm not saying this is the only way to do this, but I have heard that people feel that issuing debt is one of the ways in which you can address some of the capital projects that you may need to do, and that if they do this, then their debt metrics would weaken, meaning that we would view them as having a higher debt load. And what I would say is that all else equal, a weaker debt metric would have, a negative impact in the overall weighting of your rating. However, I don't think it is an all else equal. And when you take it into account, we just discussed how planning and operations can be negatively impacted by our view that an obligor is not addressing risk and is not taking care of those issues that could negatively impact the municipality. So between management and operations and viewing those favorably, of course, on a credit by credit basis, we would have to assess that. But there is a delicate balance between debt and why it's being issued and how it impacts all the other aspects of the credit. So in extreme cases, and I'll just touch on this quickly to make sure that we don't run out of time. And again, I say that these are in severe cases. We do have the capacity within our criteria to take a harsher look. I mean, the vast majority of municipalities that we rate are in the A and the AA category. And so these are opportunities to sort of say, longer term, we believe that there's a structural imbalance, meaning that costs that need to be taken into account do not match the revenues, and that we feel that they have not aligned their operations. And so at that opportunity, we can take them to low investment grade. In other extreme cases, if liquidity is unlikely to be replenished, we can lower the rating. And then for management, if we believe that policies are incredibly weak, if we believe that they've created plans that they can't follow through on, we can also take that opportunity to lower a rating. And these are more holistic. I think the management and structural imbalance are holistic views of how management is dealing with and addressing the issues that they're facing in terms of risk. So I'll do a short little case study. Rockport, we mentioned Hurricane Harvey. So approximately 80% of the structures sustained damage. 60% of residents were displaced. We downgraded Rockland based on our view of potential tax-based deterioration, revenue declines, and financial performance. So that on one side is where a rating was impacted, obviously by an event. However, I also wanted to highlight municipal utility districts in Texas, also impacted by Hurricane Harvey. And this is where I really want to highlight. Now, they have a different framework from which we assess the rating, but these are tax-backed. And the reason only 3% of all of our municipal utility districts received a negative outlook. There were no rating changes. Now you say, how can this be? They were flooded. This is where the credit rating agencies are also looking at, I should say S&P Global Ratings, sorry, not to speak for others. We're looking at their ability and willingness to pay. And that is really the crux of our ratings. Municipal utility districts have very large debt service reserves. Most of them have very strong other operating reserves and minimal operations. And so from our perspective, debt payment was not really weakened by this event despite some property damage. And we did look municipal utility district by municipal utility district and assess how much property had been impacted, but they also have the ability to raise their property tax rates. So places with moderate tax rates, places with strong reserves. This event, while significant in terms of human life and in terms of those issues, in terms of credit quality, did not have a longer term impact. And so just sort of highlighting that difference there. And in conclusion, I think what I'd like to say is that climate change will be increasingly considered in our ratings analysis, and challenges remain with time horizon matching and also disclosure of information. I think that's why this is a great conversation to be having. Transparency and disclosure is something that S&P absolutely supports and looks forward to. And then opportunities exist for municipal entities to mitigate climate change. And so that is really what I would like to share. And I did see that questions popped up and I was told to hold them. So if you think that I'm ignoring you, I am not. I am just going to wait till the end and we'll handle things there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And so we'll now move on to our final panelist, Ksenia Coben, who is the Vice President and Municipal Strategist at Payden & Rygel, and she'll offer insights into the types of things that investors are looking at when they're determining whether to make city-level climate resilience investments, and also to help provide a sense of what cities can do to more successfully attract investor financing for climate adaptation and resilience. And so with that, I will hand it over to Ksenia.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see my screen. I'll maximize it now. Here we go. My name is Ksenia Coben, and I'm a municipal credit analyst and strategist at Payden & Rygel. I'll start off with a few words about our firm, if you're not familiar. Payden & Rygel, we've been in business for a very long time, and I wanted to highlight, just take a few minutes to talk about our commitment to incorporating environmental, social, and governance principles in our investment process. We're a global firm with over 30 years of experience in investment management. We focus on customized solutions for our clients and can deliver tailored investment themes across all of our strategies, and we have several of them. Specifically to municipal bonds, we have a long history of investing in municipal bonds, and we've been a participant in the market for a long time. So we are very familiar with deep expertise in municipal credit and working with issuers and investors in this space. And we understand market dynamics really well. So I'm really happy to be on this panel and be part of what I think is a growing and accelerating movement to looking how municipalities and local governments can deal with environmental threats and concerns and developments, and how we can tailor credit and how we can develop our market to better assess and evaluate these risks and incorporate them in our investment process. So I wanted to take just a few minutes to tell you a little bit about our investment process, so that you can better understand how we make decisions about what to include into our portfolios. So this is a little bit on security selection, execution, and portfolio management process. We find that issuers are not always familiar with how investors make decisions about what to include in portfolios. And I just wanted to kind of take a few minutes to talk about where we start and where we end. So we begin on the far left side with issuer level fundamental analysis, which includes qualitative and quantitative factors. And this is something that is a cornerstone of our investment process and our security selection. It is where we start no matter the project we're looking at, whether it's a traditional debt financing or it's a financing that is a green bond or sustainability bond. So this is where it starts no matter what type of a deal we're looking at. Then it goes on to valuation assessment. So we look at the deal and the financing on its merits with its relationship to other fixed income instruments. So when we talk about absolute valuation, so pricing, structure, relative value analytics, these are all the things that we consider secondary to fundamental analysis. So this is where ESG elements would be considered side by side with pricing and security structure attributes. So when it comes to ESG considerations, let me just take you to that slide. When it comes to ESG considerations, there are a number of reasons why we would want to invest in resilience and adaptation projects. As I mentioned earlier, we consider all risks that may threaten or disrupt the normal course of business for an issuer, whether you're a local government, a school district, healthcare district, what you may have. So when we view climate-related events, and as Lisa mentioned, this is a growing consideration in rating analysis, but it is a component of our analysis. It is not where we start. It is, it's something that we consider as part of our broader investment process. So, but when we look at climate-related events and developments, we consider them material to the long-term health and sustainability of a credit we want to hold. We understand that not all can be easily quantified, but we stress the importance of long-term planning and good governance when it comes to dealing with changing climate and its implications for local credit. As Lisa mentioned earlier, governance and management processes are really key and really vital to our credit scorecard and to our internal credit assessment as well. And more often than not, we will assess the management structure and the governance structure above financial results. So I really wanted to stress that. And of course, I wanted to highlight the point about investing in projects and local governments that are identifying these threats early and understanding risk comprehensively and mitigating costs for themselves and their investors. We think that we see governments that are dealing with this as having foresight and and generally thinking for the tenor of the project. When I invest in a 30-year bond, for all intents and purposes, I intend to hold it for 30 years. I want to know that the issuer at issuance is thinking down the tenor with me. and thinking, what are the threats not 5, but 10 to 30 years from now, and how is the city or the entity equipped to deal with them? So I'll go on to talk now about specifics, because specifically we do look for certain financial and non-financial elements in a financing and in a project that I'll touch on here. There are not many things that we must see in a resilience or adaptation project, but they are important. Broadly, we're looking for project scope and definition. We're looking to the use of proceeds, as you might understand, as you may be familiar with green bond principles. Is, we really look to use of proceeds and how clearly they're stated and described, and if the relevant characteristics of the project, and how is it an environmental mitigation or adaptation project that really needs to be laid out clearly for us. We look for adherence to at least one green bond principle category. So we look for a project that aligns with one of the high-level categories and is adequately described. We look for language that tells us more about how much of the deal is financing versus refinancing, whether specific projects are identified, whether proceeds are tracked and segregated into accounts and sub-accounts. So these are all part and parcel of our consideration. Disclosure. We look for several types of disclosure. Most of this disclosure issuers already provide and are familiar with. And there's not a whole lot that an investor looking to invest in a resilience project is looking for that the issuer would not be able to put together or quantify or qualify. So, and then finally, one of the things we must see, as this probably goes without saying, but we just wanted to stress the fact that this goes back to sort of our relative value analysis of a project to be added to a portfolio, but deal structure and features. I mean, the project has to conform to, it must have some features of general conformity to market conditions and performance metrics. I mean, it has to have some, elements of performance in the sense of coupons must conform to market conditions, maturity and call provisions must be conforming. It has to be comparable to what we would otherwise buy in the market. So, I just wanted to put that on a page because that is important. And that is ultimately where we start when we look at a project to be added to portfolio. So, most of these requirements I have seen and I believe can be included and adequately met in the official statement. What can't be addressed in the official statement, we have seen issuers address through their public websites, consultant reports, annual operating disclosures. So these are all reporting documents that issuers are used to and are very familiar with. So this does not require a whole new level of reporting expectations. So more broadly, so as we kind of go from things that we must see in a project, I'd like to talk about things we like to see in a resilience or adaptation project. And what we like to see is a lot more broad and not necessarily quantitative in nature. One of the things I'll stress is the center bubble that intentionally uses the word sharing of information as opposed to reporting. We have found that issuers are often intimidated or discouraged by what they think investors expect out of a reporting discipline. So far, we've seen issuers take various and, for the most part, acceptable approaches to disclosure and sharing of information. And we believe that we are still in a market environment where standards and services that facilitate information flow are still developing, and there's not quite a one-size-fits-all solution at this time. So, the sharing of information in progress can take a number of forms, but commitment to transparency is really important, and it is really key. in our investment and decision process. Another input I'll draw your attention to, another bubble, is how much we value a strong relationship with data and technological solutions that cities can make use of. So I talk about non-financial information that could affect financial performance, strong relationship with data and technology, and evidence-based understanding of environmental impact and effective response. Some of the successful resilience and adaptation deals that we have seen have used evidence-based. So before they even put together a capital plan, this is, especially if it's resilience or adaptation in nature, they have done extensive studies, have collected a lot of data, have worked with public and maybe private partners. A lot of this data is publicly available. It's not proprietary. It doesn't necessarily require an additional cost for investigation, but these issuers understand what the environmental threats are and what are the most effective responses. So these projects are not born out of almost, thin air, or sort of like, well, this is, we think that this will happen, and therefore let's do a project that kind of tries to address that threat. No, these are much more evidence-based decisions, and where they really understand that what water stress is, what heat stress is, what any sea level rise, and have tailored projects that are specific to addressing those threats and can be carried out cost effectively. So that's really what I'm talking about. They've also used smart cities technology to enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of these projects and have minimized costs, generally reduced waste, ensured timely delivery of projects, and have also facilitated the reporting back to investors. So technology can work on many fronts, and we are avid proponents of cities using technology that is available to them, often at no cost. So another element that is important that I want to talk about is the minimization of policy risk through bondholder protections. This is, again, where data-driven project assessment and financing structure plays a key role. Investors want to have, whether it's adaptation or resilience or traditional projects or general capital financing, we like to have protections against policy risk. So we want to have the same protections and covenants for repayment as the traditional bond, and we don't like to see pledged revenues subject to any kind of local policy risk or changed priorities by future leadership. Because again, like I said, we're in these projects for many, many years, and we want to know that statutorily the pledged revenues are protected, potentially segregated, dedicated, and are removed from any kind of policy noise that may be going on a local level. So the final slide I have is kind of a sample deal and a report card that we would use internally. We took a look at this deal. This is a recent market issuance by the city of Tampa, Florida. It's a special assessment bond that was issued for stormwater improvement. And so it was, the bonds were secured by an assessment revenues that were they're basically applied to most of the city, and it's coterminous with the city, and these are separate from other assessments. So this is definitely a secured pledge. So, you'll notice some of the things that we put on this scorecard. We understand what the project is. We detail security features of the project. So, so they have to be conforming to market standards. This cannot come in some vacuum of market environment. This has to make sense for us from a performance and an inclusion, portfolio inclusion point of view. Has to ideally have a rating. So a rating agency, at least one, has looked at the project. And obviously some of the traditional disclosure, disclosure practices also go without saying, but the attributes that I'll point to on the left-hand side, they're not comprehensive because typically a report card this wouldn't fit on a slide, and it would be more extensive and have a lot more detail. but these are some of the more important ones we look to, and it's, again, project scope, how is it a sustainable or adaptation project, what GVP category does it fit in, what kind of disclosure and reporting the issuer commits itself to, is it certified or designated? And I intentionally chose a deal that was not third-party certified or scored by anybody. The city has self-designated these as green bonds, and it's through statutory designation, means that it didn't just put together a deal and call it green, because it, some of the projects it included could potentially be seen as environmentally beneficial. Is that ahead of the deal, it committed itself to a number of sustainability principles, voluntary guidelines, policies, and procedures. So there's an actual statute at the city level, and these bonds and this project was designated under that statute. So we do look for statutory designation. We look at statutory designation as positive, not just designation per project. And of course, bondholder protection. So some of the things that I talked about, basic coverage, projected coverage expectations, debt service reserve, segregation of revenue and construction funds, and so on. So, and then we score them. So this is kind of how we look at it. There's many other things that we could consider. There's obviously a lot to be done on the communication front between investors and issuers, and we welcome any and all of that. This is particularly delighted to participate on this webinar and improve the flow of communication between investors and issuers, road shows, webinars, anything that issuers do to disclose and educate the investor about their projects and how they're thinking about these threats and what their planning capacity is. We are happy to participate in all of those, and those could be qualitative factors that we include in our decision process. So I welcome any questions, and that's all I have for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ksenia. So we have received a number of questions, and we will dive into them now with the remaining 10 minutes. This first question is for Lisa from Tanya Graham. And so her question is, how does S&P consider risks in a community that hasn't yet looked at as climate risk? So if they don't know they have certain climate risks, how would S&P identify those risks in its rating process? One concern being that if communities do their climate planning and identify risks, but aren't yet able or ready to respond in the next 2 to 5 years, so kind of aligned with your rating perspective, it could potentially reduce their rating, which could potentially then discourage communities from looking at their climate risks. So how can communities protect their rating? Can communities protect their ratings by refusing to look at climate impacts, or does S&P have some way to identify risks that are being ignored?
Yes, thank you. This is a very good question. Disclosure from our perspective is key. We've pushed for improved disclosure in many different realms in the municipal sphere. And what I would say to this in particular is that refusing to look at climate issues, I would say is probably not the best way to protect your rating. I think if you have something that is likely to be a problem within 2 to 5 years, or you're probably in an area that we know has climate issues, there is publicly available information, there is scientific research available, and so we are able to identify areas that are at risk. And I would say at some point, not discussing the issue, it becomes a weakness in your management. So to not have looked at what your climate and weather risks are shows an incomplete assessment. Now, there are places that are at less risk, and so I would like to note that if there is an entity that is not currently looking at climate or weather because for now that's not their most pressing issue and it may be 2 or 3 years out, I mean, it all fits together in the bigger picture package. But I do think that we are aware of which areas are vulnerable, and so to not have thought about it would be considered a weakness. And those that are thinking about it and have a longer term plan, I think that just speaks to the strength of management if the plan is there. But I would emphasize that uniform disclosure would be a fantastic enhancement in this market, and something that I think that a lot of people have been talking about. So I think that is something that we highlight ourselves as something the market could really benefit by. But not discussing an issue doesn't mean that we don't know that it should be discussed.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So then a question for Ksenia from Suzanne Moser. So her question is, how would you define an effective resilience project? So how do you go about measuring that?
Yes, thank you for that question, because quantification is a really important element, and this is something that we grapple with extensively when we look at a project, because like I mentioned, quantifying the impact of a resilience project or adaptation project is not always easy or available, but we want to see that the issuer is also grappling with it, right? So we are in no position to understand the threats that are posed to any issuer locally necessarily. So we don't know what type of infrastructure you have, what type of environmental threat you face, what kind of assessment you did, and what has been your previous experience. But we want to see that you're using data, like I mentioned. Like, is it publicly available data? 427, for example, came up with a report yesterday that I thought was really excellent about geographically and regionally identifying areas and cities that face certain types of threats. And so the issuer's relationship with data and how much of it they collected, what are they using? Like, how did they come up with this particular project? Like, why is it that they think that reinforcing this seawall or addressing these stormwater improvements will help them deal with the next environmental pressure or long-term pressure? And we want to understand, we don't necessarily need to have, for example, the cost of real estate that you will be preserving, because we understand that those metrics are not yet available, and we don't expect the market to mature ahead of issuers or us necessarily, but we want to see that it's data-based, it's evidence-based. We want to see that, for example, this stormwater project or this water quality project will help us mitigate the impact of future excessive rainfall or hurricanes or whatever, and tell us exactly where the impact is and what type of assets are you trying to preserve. Like, how is this tax base, which is essentially what we invest in. We invest in a tax base and the health and quality of that tax base. How will your project help preserve that tax base? It could be numerical, it could be qualitative, but we want to see that you're also working through these challenges.
Great, thank you, Ksenia. So then we have another question for Lisa from John Miller. And so, can you speak to the difference between acute and chronic risks to property values? So when areas are permanently inundated, won't that reduce the tax base and therefore the long-term revenue?
Sure. So in terms of, the rating action that we mentioned in terms, for Rockport, that was obviously after an acute risk. And I think what I would say is, bigger picture, when you're talking about loss of land value, you have a couple of different components that we would take into account. One is, the value of that land that could be lost, and time horizon. And also, just because that is possible does not necessarily mean that there wouldn't be other revenue increases from increased valued land that has not been impacted. And so what we have to think about is not just the risk of sea level rise, but also what are the counterfactuals happening to the other land around it, what's happening to the expenditures that they are putting out there. And so remember, from our perspective, it is still about that operational balance, and simply the loss long-term of property tax revenue does not necessarily mean that a municipality would be weaker. Now, it is a risk that if not mitigated by, expenditure reductions or other revenue increases, we would need to be thinking about. But again, it's not like an on-off switch. It has to be taken into account bigger picture. And then also to understand, when that land could be impacted and what that would look like is something that is evolving for us. So it's part of a bigger picture, and our understanding of how to take those risks and make them quantifiable in different time frames is something that we continue to look at.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So then I think this will have to be our final question, but a question from Emily Massacuretti. So how can muni bond investors know whether a city is exposed to risk if the city hasn't done a risk assessment? And this is for you, Ksenia.
Thank you for that question. So how can muni bond investors know? Well, we are also avid users of data. So we expect cities to be curious and investigative on that front as well, but we also use data extensively, and there's a number of third-party providers and consultants, like I mentioned, the report that 427 put out. We read this data and we analyze our holdings. We do regional stress tests, we do city-level stress tests. When events like Harvey and hurricanes in Florida come through, investors are sitting there the next day combing through their portfolios, trying to understand where they have exposure. And then once they've on their own and through their own tools and methods decided that they are exposed and there's either short or long-term climate-related threats to their holdings, they will then turn to the issuers and turn to these credits and try to understand which of their holdings or which projects or entities that they're invested in also have an understanding of these threats and what are they doing about them. So in many cases, you're right, cities have not, or entities or a lot of enterprises, you'd be surprised how many large enterprises that deal with water infrastructure, utility infrastructure, transportation infrastructure have not done these assessments, and this is still early stages in our market. And this is part of what we do as investors is we open the lines of communication and take every opportunity we can to engage with issuers and ask them these questions. So we do it internally. We understand what the potential risks are, but we also look for data. We encourage our issuers and projects we invest in or would invest in to use data and do these climate impact or assessment studies. And, that's something we think about. When I think about investing anywhere in Florida, I want to know that the city of Miami or the city of Tampa understands their risks. And this is part of my credit due diligence, and this is part of fundamental analysis is what does the city understand about its tax base or the threats to its tax base and what it's doing. And we're still seeing it's a slow process, but it's definitely moving in the right direction, and we're having the right conversations. But I believe we have not reached perfect information in this space.
Great, thank you, Ksenia. So thank you all for calling in. Thank you first to our panelists for their great presentations, and then for all of our participants for calling in. And we apologize for not being able to address all the great questions that were raised. You're welcome to follow up with me by email, and I will route them to the appropriate individual and allow them to respond to you as they're able. And otherwise, this webinar has been recorded, and the recording will be posted on the 427 website. So please do check there if you would like to revisit or to share this. And otherwise, we look forward to interacting with you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.